The laughter did not fade right away, but it began to lose its edge, like a sound that no longer knew where it belonged. Because Lily did not react the way they expected, she did not argue. She did not defend. She simply stood there, her hand steady, the small coin catching a thin line of fluorescent light. And that was when the shift began, subtle at first, almost invisible, like the air pressure changing before a storm. Tyler felt it before he understood it, a strange hesitation creeping into his posture, his grin tightening just slightly as he glanced around for the same easy approval. But something in the room had changed, a few phones lowered, a few voices quieted, not because of Lily, not yet, but because of something else, something just outside their awareness. Coach Daniels had already moved halfway across the gym, his voice low as he spoke into his phone, not rushed, not panicked, but precise, each word measured, each pause deliberate, the kind of tone that carried weight, even when no one could hear it. And then he stopped speaking, listening instead, his expression tightening in a way that did not belong in a school setting, his eyes flicking once more toward the coin in Lily's hand before he ended the call with a quiet nod. Back at center court, Tyler exhaled sharply, forcing a laugh that sounded louder than before, trying to reclaim the moment. "See, this is what I mean," he said, gesturing toward Lily as if she were a performance. No proof, no nothing, just stories. But even as he spoke, the words did not land the same way. They hung there, thinner now, less certain. Lily finally shifted her gaze, not to Tyler, not to the crowd, but toward the far end of the gym where the double doors stood closed, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not match the tension building in the room. "You should not have asked that," she said quietly, and it was not a threat, it was not anger, it was something else entirely, something that made Tyler's smile falter for just a fraction of a second, enough for someone close to notice, enough for doubt to slip in. The gym fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint hum of the lights above and the distant echo of footsteps somewhere in the hallway, slow, steady, deliberate, too measured to be random. A few heads turned, then more, the sound growing clearer, closer, the kind of footsteps that did not rush, did not hesitate, but moved with purpose. Tyler shifted his weight, his confidence no longer as solid as it had been moments ago. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, but the question came out lower, less certain. Lily did not answer, her eyes still fixed on the doors, the coin still in her hand, unmoving, as if everything else in the room had become secondary. The footsteps stopped just outside, a brief pause, not long, but long enough to stretch the silence to its limit, and then the handle turned. The door did not burst open. It did not swing wide with urgency. It opened slowly, deliberately, the hinges releasing a soft creak that carried across the silent gym like a signal, and every head turned at once, drawn to the movement without understanding why. The fluorescent lights spilling into the hallway beyond, outlining 5 figures standing just outside, still for a moment, as if waiting for something unseen to settle. Then they stepped in together, not rushed, not hesitant, but in perfect rhythm, their footsteps quiet yet heavy with purpose, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Conversations that had already faded now disappeared completely, phones lowered one by one, the earlier laughter dissolving into something uncertain, something tighter. Tyler felt it in his chest, a pressure he could not explain, his shoulders stiffening as his eyes locked onto the men crossing the gym floor. They were not dressed for attention, no bright insignia, no loud display of rank, just simple, clean lines, controlled movement, and a stillness that seemed to quiet the entire space around them. Lily did not move, her gaze steady, the coin still resting in her palm, but something in her expression shifted, not relief, not surprise, something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition without the need for confirmation. Coach Daniels stepped back further, giving the men a clear path without a word, his posture straightening, unconsciously, as if responding to something ingrained, something older than the setting they stood in. The 5 men slowed as they reached the center of the court, their eyes scanning once, quick, precise, taking in the room, the students, the tension, the imbalance that had been hanging in the air moments before, and then the man at the front, taller, his hair touched with gray at the edges, shifted his focus, not to Tyler, not to the crowd, But directly to Lily, the connection immediate. Unmistakable. Tyler swallowed. The sound loud in his own ears, his earlier confidence now reduced to a question he could not form. He tried to speak, tried to reclaim something, anything, but the words did not come, because something had already changed, something irreversible. The man took one final step forward, stopping just a few feet away from Lily, the distance measured, respectful, and for a brief second, no one moved. No one breathed. The entire gym suspended in that moment, and then, without a word, without hesitation, he brought his hand up in a clean, precise motion, holding it there, a salute that was not for display, not for show, but for her, the gesture quiet yet undeniable, and the impact immediate, a ripple of realization spreading through the room. Tyler's eyes widened, his mind struggling to catch up to what he was seeing, because this was not a joke, not a story, not something that could be laughed off or dismissed. And as the other four men behind him came to a still, mirrored position, the silence deepened, pressing down heavier than any sound had before, until finally, the man lowered his hand slightly, his voice calm, controlled, carrying effortlessly across the room as he spoke. "Which one of you questioned Arthur Morgan?" The question did not echo, but it landed, heavy and precise, cutting through the silence like something that demanded an answer whether anyone was ready to give it or not. Tyler felt every eye shift toward him before he even realized it himself, his throat tightening as the weight of the moment settled in. The earlier laughter now gone without a trace, replaced by something colder, something far less forgiving. He glanced around, searching for the same support that had been there just minutes ago, but no one met his gaze, no one smiled, no one backed him up, their phones lowered, their expressions uncertain, and for the first time since this started, Tyler looked alone, completely alone. The man at the front did not raise his voice, did not repeat the question. He simply waited, his posture steady, his presence filling the space without effort. And that patience somehow made it worse, because it left no room for escape, no room for pretending this was anything other than real. Tyler swallowed again, his voice finally coming out, but it lacked the sharpness it once had. I was just asking," he said, the words stumbling over themselves, trying to sound casual, trying to pull the moment back into something smaller, something safer, but it did not work. The man's gaze did not shift, did not soften. It remained fixed, calm, and unwavering, as if measuring something deeper than the words themselves. "You were not asking," he said quietly, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just a statement, simple and undeniable, the kind that left no space for argument. Tyler's shoulders dropped slightly, the confidence draining out of him as quickly as it had once filled him. Behind the man, the other four stood just as still, their eyes scanning the room, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with a level of awareness that made everything feel exposed, like nothing could be hidden. Lily remained where she was, her hand relaxing just slightly around the coin, her breathing steady, as if this moment had already been decided long before anyone else realized it. The man shifted his attention back to her, and for a brief second, the intensity in his expression softened, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something respectful. "Lily Morgan," he said, her name clear and certain, and a ripple moved through the room again. Because he did not ask, he knew. Tyler's head snapped toward her, then back to the man, confusion and disbelief colliding all at once. "We were told you might need us," the man continued, his voice even, controlled, each word carrying the weight of something larger than the moment itself. Lily did not respond right away, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, the silence stretching just long enough to make everyone lean into it, waiting, watching, and then she spoke, her voice still soft, but steady. "I did not call," she said, and the man gave the slightest nod, as if that answer confirmed everything he needed to know. "No," he replied, glancing briefly toward Coach Daniels at the edge of the gym. "You did not." The acknowledgement subtle but clear, the chain of events now visible to those paying attention. Tyler shifted again, his hands no longer sure where to rest, his earlier stance gone, replaced by uncertainty that showed in every movement, every breath. And then the man looked back at him, not with hostility, not with intimidation, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet certainty. Arthur Morgan does not speak about what he did, he said, his tone unchanged. And neither do we. The words settled into the space, heavier than anything that had come before, because they carried implication without explanation, meaning without detail. Tyler's mouth opened slightly, then closed, whatever response he had dissolving before it could form, and the man took a small step back, not retreating, but resetting the space, giving the moment room to breathe. But we do remember, he added, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, thick with realization, pressing down on everyone in the room as the weight of what had just been revealed began to settle in. The words did not fade when he finished speaking. They settled, lingering in the air like something that refused to be ignored, and for a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire gym caught in the weight of what had just been said. Tyler felt it most of all. The shift that had started as uncertainty now fully formed into something he could not control, his chest rising slower, heavier, his eyes darting once more to the faces around him, searching for an anchor, for someone to laugh again, to break the tension. But there was nothing, only quiet, only the realization spreading from one person to the next. Lily stood unchanged, her posture steady, but the tightness in her hand had eased, the coin now resting more naturally in her palm, as if it had done its job, as if it had already spoken louder than anything she could have said. The man in front of her lowered his gaze briefly, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement, his eyes settling on the coin for just a second longer than necessary. And something passed through his expression, something almost imperceptible, recognition layered with memory, the kind that did not need explanation. Behind him, one of the others shifted slightly, not breaking formation, but enough to signal awareness, a shared understanding that moved through the group without a word. Coach Daniels exhaled quietly from across the gym, his shoulders dropping just a fraction, as if a tension he had been carrying was finally released, his phone still in his hand, though now it hung loosely at his side. The call finished, its purpose fulfilled. Tyler cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the silence, drawing attention he no longer wanted. I did not mean anything by it, he said, the words coming slower now, stripped of the earlier confidence. It was just, just talk. But even as he said it, he seemed to understand how hollow it sounded, how little it mattered in the face of what stood before him. The man listened, his expression unchanged, not dismissive, not harsh, simply present. Words matter, he replied, calm and direct, not as a warning, but as a truth, and that truth seemed to land harder than anything else. Tyler nodded slightly, almost involuntarily, his shoulders lowering as the last of his resistance faded. The room around him no longer a stage, no longer a place where he held control, but something entirely different, something that demanded respect whether he understood it or not. Lily finally shifted her weight, just enough to break the stillness, her eyes moving briefly across the faces of the 5 men, then back to the one in front. He never talks about it, she said softly, echoing what had already been said, but with a different weight, a different meaning. The man gave a small nod again, this time slower, more deliberate. That is why we do, he answered, not loudly, not for the room, but for her. And yet everyone heard it, because the silence carried it, held it, amplified it in a way no raised voice ever could. A faint sound came from the hallway again, distant footsteps, slower this time, heavier with age, not synchronized like the ones before, but steady, measured, and familiar in a different way. Lily's gaze shifted once more toward the door, something in her expression changing again, softer now, almost imperceptible. The man noticed, his eyes following hers, and for the first time since he had entered, he stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, but making space, creating a path that had not been there before. The others followed without hesitation, their movements subtle, precise, forming a quiet line that faced the door, not as a barrier, but as something else entirely, something closer to anticipation. And as the faint sound of approaching steps grew clearer, the entire room seemed to lean into that moment, waiting without knowing exactly why, until the handle began to turn once more. The handle turned slowly, almost deliberately, and the door opened just enough for a sliver of hallway light to cut across the polished gym floor, stretching long and thin until it reached the line of men who had already stepped aside, their formation holding, their attention fixed forward. And then he stepped in, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a quiet steadiness that seemed to shift the air in a different way than before. Arthur Morgan did not look like a legend, not in the way stories try to describe one. He wore a simple jacket, worn at the edges, jeans that had seen better days, and a pair of boots that moved with a measured rhythm across the floor, each step grounded, each movement unforced, his hair silvered by time, his posture slightly bent but never weak, his eyes clear, observant, taking in the room without searching for attention. The gym remained completely silent. The earlier tension now transformed into something deeper, something closer to recognition even among those who did not understand why. Lily's hand relaxed completely as she saw him, the coin now resting loosely between her fingers, her shoulders easing for the first time since the moment began. Arthur's gaze found her almost immediately, not scanning, not questioning, just knowing. And for a brief second, the faintest hint of a smile touched his expression, subtle, quiet, gone as quickly as it appeared. He did not look at Tyler, did not acknowledge the crowd. His focus remained on Lily as he walked forward. The sound of his boots soft against the floor, steady as a heartbeat. The 5 men standing nearby shifted in unison, not stepping forward, not drawing attention, but straightening just slightly, their posture aligning with something unspoken, something instinctive. As Arthur approached, he stopped a few feet from Lily, the same distance the others had kept, as if the space itself held meaning. He looked at the coin in her hand, then back to her face, his voice low, calm, carrying without effort. "You held on to it," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement. Lily nodded once, her voice soft but steady. "You told me not to lose it," she replied, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them, the noise of the world outside fading completely. Arthur gave a slight nod, his eyes lingering on hers, something unspoken passing between them, something built over years that no one else in the room could fully understand. Behind him, the man who had spoken earlier took one step forward, precise and controlled, and then stopped, his voice respectful, measured in a way that carried weight without force. "Sir," he said, the single word enough to draw every eye again. Arthur did not turn immediately. He did not react the way the room expected. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been carrying long before this moment. And then he shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him without fully facing it. "You did not have to come," he said quietly. The words simple, almost reluctant, but the man shook his head once, firm, unwavering. "We did," he answered, and the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. The other 4 remained still, their attention fixed, their posture unchanged, as if the moment itself demanded it. Tyler stood frozen where he was, the reality of what he was witnessing settling in piece by piece, his earlier words echoing in his mind, now stripped of meaning, replaced by something heavier, something he could not undo. Arthur finally turned slightly, just enough for his gaze to pass over the group of men, not assessing, not questioning, simply acknowledging, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that required no explanation, no elaboration, just understanding. And then the man in front straightened fully, his movement sharp but controlled, and once again he raised his hand in a clean, deliberate salute, holding it there, steady and unwavering, the other 4 following in perfect synchronization, the gesture silent yet undeniable. And this time, it was not just for Lily, it was for him. The salutes did not drop immediately. They held, suspended in the still air of the gym, 5 men standing in perfect alignment, their arms raised not out of formality, but out of something far deeper, something earned long before anyone in that room had ever heard the name Arthur Morgan. And for a moment, time itself seemed to slow, every eye locked onto the scene, every breath measured, uncertain, as if no one wanted to be the one to break it. Arthur did not return the salute right away. He stood there, quiet, his gaze moving across each of them, not counting, not assessing, but remembering, the kind of look that carried years behind it, years that were not spoken, not displayed, but understood by those who stood before him. Lily watched from just a few feet away, her eyes moving between her grandfather and the men who stood for him, her expression shifting slowly, the weight of everything settling in piece by piece. The story she had never been told now unfolding without words. Right in front of her, Arthur finally lifted his hand, not with sharp precision, not with the crispness of ceremony, but with a slower, steadier motion, one that carried its own kind of authority, and he returned the salute, holding it just long enough for the moment to complete itself, for the respect to move both ways. And then, just as quietly, both sides lowered their hands. The motion synchronized without command, without instruction, because it did not need either. Tyler felt something in his chest tighten as he watched, something he could not name, something unfamiliar. The earlier confidence now completely gone, replaced by a quiet realization that settled deeper with every second. His eyes flicked to Lily, then back to Arthur, trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the words he had mocked, and failing, because nothing about this moment fit into what he had expected, what he had assumed. The man who had first spoken stepped forward again, but this time his posture shifted slightly, less rigid, more personal, his voice still controlled, but carrying something else now, something closer to memory. "We thought you would not come," he said, and Arthur gave a small shake of his head, almost dismissive. "I did not," he replied simply, and there was no elaboration, no explanation, just the truth as it stood. The man nodded once, accepting it without question, because he understood what the others did not, that coming here had not been about obligation, had not been about proving anything. It had been about something else entirely, something that did not need to be explained to be real. Lily shifted slightly, stepping just a fraction closer, her presence now fully within the space that had been created around her. "I did not tell them," she said softly, her voice carrying in the silence. Arthur glanced at her, the faintest trace of warmth returning to his expression. "You did not have to," he answered, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle everything at once, because it meant that none of this had been about convincing anyone. None of it had been about winning an argument or proving a point. It had simply been about truth, and truth, once present, did not need defense. Tyler took a small step back without realizing it, the distance between him and the center of the court growing, not because anyone told him to move, but because something inside him understood that he no longer belonged in that space, not in the way he had before. His voice, when it finally came again, was barely more than a whisper. "I did not." "No," he said, and this time, no one laughed, no one reacted, because the statement no longer mattered. Arthur did not look at him, did not acknowledge the words directly, but after a moment, he spoke, his voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach him. "That is why you listen," he said, and the lesson landed without force, without anger, but with a weight that would stay far longer than anything else said that day. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was no longer filled with tension or uncertainty. It was something else now, something closer to respect, something that had not been there when this began. And as the moment stretched on, the five men stepped back in unison, not breaking their presence, but easing it, allowing the space to return, allowing the room to breathe again, while Arthur turned slightly toward Lily, his focus returning to her, the reason he had come, the reason any of this had happened at all. The tension did not snap. It unraveled slowly, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. The air in the gym easing in a way no one could quite explain. Conversations did not restart, laughter did not return, but something shifted, something quieter, something steadier. Lily stood there for a moment longer, the weight of everything settling into her chest. Not heavy, not overwhelming, but grounding, like a truth finally finding its place. Arthur looked at her, not with pride, not with expectation, but with a calm understanding that asked for nothing and gave everything at the same time. "You did not need to stand alone," he said quietly, and Lily shook her head just slightly, her voice soft but certain. "I was not alone," she replied, her fingers brushing lightly over the coin, and Arthur gave a small nod, as if that answer was exactly what he had hoped for. Behind them, the five men had stepped back further now, no longer the center of the moment, but still present, still watching, their posture relaxed but never careless. The kind of awareness that never fully faded. Coach Daniels finally moved again, stepping forward just enough to close the distance he had kept, his eyes moving from Arthur to Lily, then back again, a quiet respect settling into his expression. "Sir," he said, not formally, not loudly, but with a tone that carried weight all the same. Arthur acknowledged him with a slight tilt of his head. Nothing more, nothing less. And that was enough. Tyler remained near the edge of the court, no longer trying to speak, no longer trying to explain. His earlier words echoing in his mind in a way that felt distant now, disconnected from the reality standing in front of him. He watched as Arthur shifted his attention once more to Lily, the world narrowing again to just the two of them. "You should head home soon," Arthur said, his voice calm, practical, as if this were any other day, any other moment. And that simplicity made everything else feel even more profound. Lily nodded, though she did not move right away, her eyes lingering, as if trying to hold on to something that could not be fully captured. "Are you staying?" she asked, the question quiet, almost hesitant, and Arthur paused, just for a second, his gaze drifting briefly past her, toward the 5 men who stood a few yards away, then back again. "Not long," he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that carried more than the words themselves, something about time, about distance, about things that did not need to be explained. Lily seemed to understand, or at least accept it, because she nodded again, this time more firmly, her shoulders straightening just slightly, the moment no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, but complete in a way that did not require anything more. The room around them remained quiet, but it was no longer watching in the same way. It was no longer filled with curiosity or doubt. It was something else now, something closer to reflection, as if everyone present was trying to process what they had just seen, what they had just felt. Tyler finally looked down, his hands at his sides, his posture no longer guarded, no longer defensive, just still, as if he were standing in a place he did not yet understand. And then Arthur turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple shift of movement. And as he did, the 5 men straightened once more. Not in formation, not in display, but in quiet acknowledgement, their presence aligning with his without a word, without a signal, because it did not need one. And as they began to move toward the door, their steps measured, their pace unhurried. The sound of their movement carried softly across the gym floor, fading with each step, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but full of something that would stay long after they were gone. The doors did not slam behind them. They closed softly, the quiet click barely audible, yet it marked the end of something that no one in the gym could fully put into words. The space they left behind felt different now, not empty, but changed, as if the air itself had been reset. Lily stood where she was for a few seconds longer, the coin still resting in her hand, lighter now, no longer something she had to hold on to tightly, but something she simply carried. Arthur paused near the doorway, his hand brushing lightly against the frame, not stopping, not hesitating, just taking in the moment in his own quiet way before stepping out of sight. The 5 men followed without a word, their presence fading down the hallway, their footsteps growing softer until they disappeared completely, and still, no one spoke. Coach Daniels finally let out a slow breath, one he had been holding since the moment he recognized the coin, his eyes moving across the room, taking in the students who now stood in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but reflective, as if each of them had been given something they did not know they needed, something they would carry long after they left that gym. Tyler remained at the edge of the court, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just still, his gaze fixed on the place where Arthur had stood, his mind replaying everything that had happened, the words he had said, the way the room had shifted, the moment the men had walked in, the salute, the silence, all of it settling into something he could not ignore. He took a small step forward, then stopped, unsure of what to do next, unsure of what could even be said after something like that. Lily finally turned, her movement simple, natural, as if the moment had already passed for her in a way it had not for anyone else. She walked toward the exit, not rushing, not looking back, just moving forward, the coin now tucked gently into her palm, a quiet reminder of something she no longer needed to explain. As she passed Tyler, He opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something, to apologize, to ask, but the words never came, because for the first time, he understood that some things were not meant to be explained in that way. Some things were meant to be learned in silence. Lily paused for just a fraction of a second beside him, not turning, not meeting his eyes, but acknowledging his presence all the same. "He told me something once," she said softly, her voice calm, steady, carrying just enough for him to hear. Tyler looked at her, waiting, the weight of the moment pressing in again, but different this time, quieter. "Respect is not something you ask for," she continued, her fingers tightening slightly around the coin. "It is something people remember." She did not wait for a response, did not need one. She simply continued walking, her steps light against the floor as she moved toward the doors, leaving behind a space that felt fuller than when she had entered. Tyler stood there, the words settling into him in a way that felt permanent, something that would stay, something that would come back to him long after this day was over. Around him, the room slowly began to shift back to normal conversations, starting in low voices, phones lowering completely, the world returning to its usual rhythm, but not quite the same, not exactly as it had been before, because something had been seen, something had been understood, even if not fully, and as the last echoes of footsteps faded down the hallway, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was filled with something quiet, something lasting, something that did not need to be spoken to be known.